Well, Arkane Studios, owned by Bethesda and Microsoft, has released their new IP, Redfall, and it's definitely a game that's difficult to take a look at in the void based on what they previously have released. When thinking of Arcane, you're more than likely going to think of the much-loved Dishonored series, the Prey reboot, and their previous release, Deathloop. Arcane is known for creating these highly interactive worlds, or just even large open levels, where the player is given the tools to go through and complete whatever tasks they need to complete, and then are set free upon the game world. They're known for their immersive sims. That's not Redfall. Redfall is in an entirely different genre. It's a solo or co-op looter shooter, where you play as a character who has various special abilities, such as a looter shooter, to help fight various vampires, their cultist followers, and a PMC group present. So it's a vast departure from what they previously have been known to do. Now, this couldn't be farther from what fans come to expect from Arcane themselves. In many ways, it's extremely different and not at all like the immersive sims that they previously released, and I do believe that's also why it's being received so poorly, on top of various performance issues, bugs, and glitches. Otherwise, you're just looking at a game that's launching with only a 30 FPS option available on the Series X and S, as well as plenty of other bugs, glitches, and even some performance issues on PCs. A few bugs I encountered, and the performance issues I'll go ahead and catalog as well. So let's just start there with the ugly parts of this game. Redfall launched with only 30 FPS mode on Xbox Series X and S. Those are last generation frame rates right there. I do believe that it wholly has to do with the open world aspects of the game for each region, even on PC, when in some areas of the open world I did encounter my frame rate dropping below what it should be running at. Now, in the instance locations, such as nests or traversing between locations for the game when you're in essentially a corridor, there were no issues. The game ran great. It ran incredibly smoothly. There's no frame drops, no issues of the like, but in the open world, there's definitely some issues with the game. Typically, when crossing the border from one segment of the region to another, the game just seemingly freezes for a moment or two while loading assets on the other side of that region. This can be a bit jarring, is definitely not a great thing, but this is my experience on the PC from running the game on an SSD. However, in those hallway sections, like I mentioned, when you're not moving between regions, the game is running perfectly fine. There's no frame rate drop, there's no performance dips, there's nothing of that ilk going on. Now, there have been plenty of recorded bugs and glitches floating around the internet, definitely many a video of these happening, since it's another released $70 game that is not fully optimized or ready for release, even at all, it seems. I myself have encountered just two. One where various vampire enemy units can't be shot or interacted with, and so they just kind of float around and do nothing, or they sit and do nothing. You can't shoot them or anything like that. And the one where my mouse wasn't working in any of the menus. I couldn't move the map, I couldn't select things in the map, I couldn't select guns or anything like that. So those were the two bugs I encountered. However, there could be numerous other ones you would encounter yourself if you gave the game a try. Though, yeah, your mileage will definitely vary across the board, much like with last week's launch disaster of Jedi Survivor. Now, these drops in the frame rate issues, though, those are definitely not acceptable when taking a look at the game itself. It's by no means cutting-edge graphics. It's definitely in line with the stylization that Arcane has done prior with their games, which they've done with all of their games, excluding maybe even Prey. Prey was a little more realistic looking, but you're looking at Dishonored and Deathloop, definitely on the side of more stylized artwork. It looks good, it looks okay, it's not amazing, but as you trudge through the different areas, the environments get more detailed, or they have their own little flair, so the game looks good. But like I said, it's not anything like, say, the upcoming Final Fantasy 16 or The Last of Us. It's not meant to look realistic, and so it's just baffling about how these issues can persist with this game. These are honestly just not acceptable frame rate drops, and that the game launched with only the 30 FPS mode on consoles is also unacceptable, especially coming from a studio owned by Microsoft. With the technical woes aside, well, Redfall it's just a run-of-the-mill looter shooter when it comes down to it. You have 4 different characters to choose from when you start up the game. There's also no multiplayer progression just because they said that there's an abundance of additional content that you can go through and choose to do or not to do, different like small choices here or there. So that's why there's no progression saved between multiplayers. However, the characters do retain their level. If you're playing with someone, you just have to continue the story on your own, which it's not that long. It took me like 15 hours to get through the full story, and that was playing solo, dealing with large groups of enemies on their own, dying occasionally when I bit off more than I can chew. But back to the main thing here at hand, there's 4 different characters, 4 different abilities. Typically, you'll have like an offensive ability or a shielding ability, a buff, a debuff, or something like that. Typically, a movement ability, aside from one character who has a C4 explosive she throws, and then an ultimate skill, which you charge with psychic residual energy, which you pick up from killing vampire enemies. The cooldowns, they're pretty low. You can also, in some skills, in the skill trees for those, spec into lower cooldowns or increased area of effect or more damage or debuffs, etc. So there is a bit of customization here, but your skills are something you will be using quite a bit. You have 3 different gun slots you can equip weapons in. Pretty run-of-the-mill here. Pistols, shotguns, assault rifles, sniper rifles. Then you have a few other ones like flare guns for fire AoE. You have a stake gun, which shoots stakes, deals high damage to vampires. And then you also have a UV gun, which is kind of a ray to try to petrify vampire enemies so you can shatter them or easily damage them with melee, something like that. You also have these 2 like little relic slots, one for vampire blood, which gives you a health bonus and some other sort of passive benefits, and then you have your vampire god relic, which you get vampire god relics at major points in the game for defeating a vampire god, and they also provide different character alterating buffs. Now, there's also just some cosmetics you can run around and grab from different outfits for your characters, head, backpack, and then outfit itself. So clothing, different skins for your guns, different skins for your stakes. So there's all of that too. And going around there, the looting is a bit unique as well. You'll come across many things in the world that you can loot and many things that you cannot. That was one weird issue I had, is like you can grab 1 spool of wire from the stack of wire, but the other 4 will just still remain there. However, when you do grab this, it's automatically changed into currency for you to use at the various vendors at the safe houses or main points of a region. Guns, you will have to manually disassemble yourself to get the currency, but so there's no actual need to pick up stuff, manage that in your inventory, then run to a vendor to sell it. So that's a nice little cutout there. It's very streamlined. It works pretty well. Gameplay-wise, it's honestly nothing special. It's a looter shooter. It's not genre-defining, but it's not the worst looter shooter or looter we've had in the last few years. I think a great way to put it is that it's not a great game, but it's not bad either. It's definitely there in the middle, just kind of existing. It's Arcane's first steps outside of their typical immersive sim style of games. They went for a co-op multiplayer looter shooter, which are very popular. They do have longevity when you're looking at how long a game can be played, because there is replayability in there, and there are replayable elements to the game itself. But yeah, it's definitely not what people are used to. It's not amazing, it's not bad, it just kind of exists there, right in the middle. One major thing I did notice initially was that I was a little off-put by a lack of enemy density in the open world as I traversed across it, but I began noticing that the enemies were more heavily focused around areas where it makes sense that they would be. There are more enemies around shopping districts and neighborhoods as opposed to running around randomly in the countryside. Now, that's not to say around points of interest in the countryside or just roaming you won't come across enemies, but they're definitely more sparse there. This was off-putting. I didn't like it at first, but then I remembered just kind of like the shit show and the awful feeling it was in Atomic Heart with that enemy density, the infinitely respawning enemies, the 5 enemies around every single corner, the new enemies being flown in, the enemies being repaired by repair bots. It was just an awful experience, and so I took a step back, looked at it, and was like, no, this is actually fine. You're not hindered in progressing your story. You can get from point A to point B very quickly. You can just avoid those fights altogether by just sneaking around the groups. It is actually a well-designed overworld, and they did put some thought into that sort of functionality in the enemy density in the open world. Now, out in this open world, you do have the typical trappings of an open world game. You have safe houses, each with 2 different missions to upgrade them slightly. You have a side quest that you start off, and then once you complete that, you have a mini boss you need to go kill, kind of like an elite vampire. Then you take its skull. Each main hub will be where you pick up most of your quests. You'll have a mission board where you'll have a tree of quests. You can branch them out. You can only do 1 main mission at a time. There's also a few locations that you can visit, and you'll run across little quest items or quest out in the open world to pick up and complete. So it's all there. It's all pretty basic stuff. There are locations called historical sites, which you'll unlock as fast travel points across the world, so you don't have to run everywhere on your own. So that was a nice thing to notice, is that there is fast travel in the game, and it is utilized quite a bit. I mean, I at least utilized it quite a bit. And vampire nests are the big draw for replayability within this game. What they're looking for, they're like little instant dungeons. They are completely separate instances, little shooting corridors, all with different affixes affecting how they play, from the vampires being all in a blood trance, essentially asleep until you provoke them, to giving them buffs, to weakening them, adding a variety of the special vampires to each encounter. And at the very end, you destroy the nest's heart. You have a minute then to loot essentially what are just like little tiny caverns to grab loot, and then get out and escape. The game runs really great in this. The game should have probably just been a bunch of instances like this and replayability, much like with how Neo runs or anything by Team Ninja and their Souls-like, because the game would have ran great then. There'd be no issues with performance. It's just the open world sections. So yeah, honestly, it is just a very generic looter shooter at its core. But being Arcane, they really did add bits of lore here or there that you can collect and read over. It doesn't make it more interesting. And they do have a good, unique twist on a looter shooter that we haven't seen before. Vampires taking over a town, killing vampire gods. The little bits of lore, the little stories, the news clippings, all of that is actually really interesting to go through and read if you want to take the time. If not, it's just something you can skip over. Overall, I don't know if I would recommend this game to purchase. If you have GamesPass, I'd definitely say give it a go. It's a competent looter shooter outside of the present bugs, which I'm sure will be fixed in due time. It's just how studios work anymore, which they shouldn't. They release games with bugs and stuff, but they have been working on it for quite a while and pulling it back, so it was probably in a really rough state before the last pushback of the release date. But yeah, it's definitely not the worst game to launch in the last couple of weeks, I would say. But for the price of $70, like I said, I really can't recommend this title. Unless you're just super into looter shooters and like the idea of killing vampires and their cultist followers in the game as opposed to any other thing. I had fun, I can't deny that. But it wasn't an overly unique experience outside of it just being from Arcane, and there are bits of lore that you can voluntarily go through and read as you collect them within the game. For $70, definitely a no-go.